Okay, welcome. This is a video on command line arguments and the argparse module. Now, command line arguments refer to our ability to go to the command line, issue a command, and add additional instructions, input, whatever is meaningful to us. I'll give you an example. If I say ls at the command line, remember on Windows the command is dir, and I just hit enter, it's going to default to showing me the files that are in my home directory, because that's where I am currently. I'm currently in my home directory, and ls by itself will do that for me. However, if I give it, let's say, a -l flag, it gives me a long listing. This is configuring how the ls command works. It gives me a longer listing that includes the last modified time, the size of the file, etc. And if I also say desktop as an additional argument, and now the ls command is being called or is being run with 2 arguments, then it's going to list out the desktop directory with the files in a long listing. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the command line arguments are necessary for us to fully understand exactly how developers tend to run their programs, and that includes the Python programs. Python programs also can come with a command line arguments, and in fact what we'll do in our first session is start out by writing programs that accept arguments at the command line. Now, the command line arguments are read in one of 2 ways for us. The standard way, or the most basic way, is through the sys module and the sys.argv variable. Now, in order to run this in class 1.2 py file, I'm going to need to go make my way over to the folder that holds this file. And I was able to do that. You may notice if you slow that down that I'm typing the first few letters of the directory that I want to go into, and then just hitting tab, and it types out the rest for me. That's called tab completion. Takes me into my in-class exercises, and now I can run this file that I have up in class 1.2 from the command line, and it shows me this. Well, what is this? This is what is being shown when I print sys.argv. Okay, well, I think you can see just by looking at it that it's a list, and it's a list of 1 string. The sys.argv list is built into Python. It's something that comes with the sys module. It is created by the sys module, and it's made available by importing the sys module. And this list that we see here, as it looks like, contains the name of the program. This is the first item to be found in the sys.argv list. But if I were to run this script again with, let's say, some arguments, here we have 4 arguments at the command line. Now, you should keep in mind that I'm not referring to function arguments. I'm referring to command line arguments. It's a different use of the term. Arguments still means input to whatever I'm doing here. In the case of a function, the argument is, or arguments, are the objects that I pass to the function in the function call. Well, this is very similar. I'm passing 4 strings to my script. Now, this has nothing to do with a function. These are arguments that are going to the script. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to get input into my script. Now, of course, we've talked about the input function, and we know how the input function works. When we call input, we have a prompt, and it's all very user-friendly, right? It explains exactly what it wants. And then we can give it to them. So if I ran this again, please enter this, David. You said David, okay. Now here's the difference. The input function is fine, and it, just like the sys.argv, it receives a string, right? If we type DAVID, it receives a string, the string gets assigned to UI, and we can just use it wherever we'd like. That is convenient, and it is sometimes the way we want to go. But most of the time, we actually would prefer to have our arguments come in at the command line. So I would run, let's see, we'll get rid of this. I would run this program with just David, and I would get that argument. Now, if I wanted to emulate what I did before, how am I going to get the David argument out of the sys.argv list? Well, you shouldn't think of this sys.argv list as being any different than any other list. So if I wanted to get that first name, I could get it out using sys.argv1. Right? So now when I run it, I put in David at the command line and it says you said David. Okay, that's doing the same thing that input would have done, but the advantage is that we don't need to deal with a prompt when we're running the script. If all we're interested in doing is taking some input and we know what that input is right at the beginning, then there's no need to make the user execute our script, then wait for the prompt, then type something in the prompt, and then hit enter. We can just have them do it all in one shot. What's more, if they want to run the script more than once or run with different input, they can do it using the up arrow command history and run it as many times as they like, and the input is going in each time. There are other advantages as well, but just keep in mind that developers tend to prefer the command line over the input function. The input function is a little bit clunky, and it also requires that a human be at the keyboard ready to type something. And if you want to run the script again, you have to retype it. sys.argv is superior to this. I mentioned a human being at the keyboard. Sometimes we want to run a script, give it input, but there is no human. What can I mean by that? Sometimes we run a script at 6 in the morning. We have the computer run it automatically. We say, we would like this script to run at 6 in the morning with this input. Well, you can tell the computer to do that, and it will execute the script exactly how I'm doing here. And it doesn't require a human being to say, oh, I want the input to be George, which was what input would do. So this is the first part. When we want to take arguments at the command line, one option is to just read the sys.argv list. Now, that's all very well and good, but there's actually an even more sophisticated module that can be used to accept command line arguments, and it's called argparse. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and go to my own materials for this, and I have it right here. Argparse is a module that allows us to have a rather more sophisticated a set of arguments, specifically arguments that have names. The thing about sys.argv is that it will accept arguments, and if you have only 1 or 2 arguments, you can say, okay, the first argument will be this, the second argument will be that, and so when you run it, put in first name and then last name, and it'll work properly. Nothing wrong with that, absolutely nothing wrong with that, but when we have more arguments, it can be rather complicated and a little bit challenging to work out the clarity on this, to have multiple arguments. For example, here's an imaginary program in which we're taking a 4-digit year, a factor, and then 3 flavors. It's made up, but leave it. What we're doing here is we're working with a module called argparse, right? This argparse module that lets us determine ahead of time what we want our arguments to be and give them names so that when the user calls the program, they can put names in front of each of the arguments. What's more, we can have some arguments be required. argparse will handle that for us. We can have arguments that will accept multiple values. We can have arguments that might be only one of a few choices. And argparse will manage all of this for us. It'll manage restrictions on the arguments, and it'll also allow us to have arguments that might even have multiple parts. These are the flavors. So we're going to go over each one of these. On top of that, argparse also gives us help messages. If we call the program with help, it's going to give us a built-in, something we did not have to create, a built-in help message, which includes the arguments that are required and the arguments that are optional, and it'll work for us. So the first thing that we do is we import argparse, and I'm also importing a couple of other modules here because I also want it to be a little more sophisticated here. I'm importing argparse, but I'm also importing OS and sys. The reason I have sys is because sys.argv0, as we showed earlier, will give me the name of the program. And the reason I have OS is that OS path base name will actually, if there happens to be a path here leading to the program name, like for instance, if it was, let's say, something like users David and myprog.py, base name will just give me myprog. That's what base name does. And so I'm using the prog argument, which will be used by argparse, to indicate the program name. I'm doing that, and I'm making it automatically the name of the program that I'm running. And then this description is also just part of the help message. If you look at what the help message was earlier, you see, first off, it shows my program name. And then also it displays, when it's showing the help, it displays this message. So this is my way of configuring the help message so that it's correct for this program. You'll see that I'm taking argparse and I'm calling argument parser. Now this is a new class that's part of argparse, and it's going to create an argument parser object, or I'll just call it a parser object. What's a parser object? Doesn't really matter. We don't really need to know too much about it. We just need to know the concept of what we're delivering here. Parser will give us access to the arguments, and it will parse the arguments for us. What we do is when we want to add an argument to the parser, we'll use the add argument method. And why don't I just go ahead and follow what we have here in this example. And I use the add argument method to indicate first what are the names that I can use to identify this argument, or what will the user use, and then also some other additional options, for example, required, which will make the argument required. So now at this point, if I run this program and I don't give it any argument at all, it'll stop. Should stop. It's not stopping. I wonder why not. Guess I have this here already. One more time. Okay, it says it's required. Oh, I know what the problem is. I didn't do one additional method. This is basically activates the module. So it's not going to do anything until I tell it to go ahead and look at the arguments and see if they're there and do its other processing. So now when I run it, it tells me, okay, this argument was required. If I take required out, obviously it won't do that. So I can choose if I want an argument to be required to designate it as such. When I'm done, and I think I've made a mistake here, I need to say args equals argparse, because now if I want to look at the year argument, for example, I can find it as an attribute of the whatever we'll call this, this argument object. So if I now put in year and say 1972, I'll get back 1972. And as you can see, I can also use -y to get that argument as well. This argument is required, so I have to put it in. And when I'm ready, it's available under this year attribute, which is named after this. Okay, cool. Now there are a couple of other options that we might give. We could put in one that has only one of a few choices. So if we have, let's say, a factor, and we can make this required as well. We can give it choices, and the choices are whatever we'd like it to be. But if we don't give that, if we give it D, it's going to tell us that's an invalid choice, and it'll even give us the choices that we have. So if I give it C, it's all good. And of course, you know that I can get the factor out by using args.factor. Then the last thing that I'd like to show you as far as the argument options, and there are several, is the, I'll just do the same thing with flavors here. I guess I can't call it F, so I'm going to call it X, and we'll make it required. And this nargs stands for number of arguments, and nargs allows us to specify there's one, there's two, there are 3 arguments required. This plus is saying I will take any number of arguments. So if I run this with flavors, let me run it to the top, flavors, I can say cherry, vanilla, chocolate. And actually before I run it, I'm going to go ahead and print the factor. And then I'm going to print args.flavors. And what we'll see is that when we're ready to go and we have these flavors, multiple flavors, that they'll come to us in a list. So year was one argument, so it comes in as a string. C, the factor is another single argument, and so it comes in as a string. But the nargs plus for flavors allows us to say that there may be several, and so we can know that the flavors attribute will deliver a list of the values that I put in. There are a number of other restrictions and configurations that you can add to add argument. If you look in the slides, I have a link to the page that shows those different variables. Actually, I can pull that up pretty quickly. Argparse Python. If I look for the documentation here, it takes us pretty quickly to the different configurations, the different optional arguments we can put here. Here's choices. Here's default. Default allow you to set a default if the argument is not passed. Choices, as I showed you before. Here's a good one. Type will actually convert it to a correct type. So if I wanted this second argument of year, if I wanted the first argument year to be an integer, and I want it to come out as an integer, and I would even like it to reject any input that's not an integer, I can say type equals int. And I believe this will work. Now that worked, but if I give it, let's say, something that's not an integer, I believe it will fail, and it'll say invalid int value. What's more, when I do give it the correct value, it will come in as an integer. So I should be able to, let's say, add 1 to it to prove that it's an integer. Let's see. Yeah, so now it says 1973, because not only did it validate the input as integer to make sure that it is a proper integer, but it also retrieves it, or it allows me to retrieve it as an integer. So that's another option, and there's several others, and you can look for some of these. The help message will be a specific message about that argument if you want to have a help. You could set the attribute name to be different if you prefer, and that's about all I got here. Oh, here's the action, and this is actually something that I should mention. Normally the default is store, but some flags are actually designed to be true or false. So what if we said that there was one more, and we'll set it as a flag. You know, we're going to call it is live, something like that, and then we'll say action equals store true. What this will do is allow me to pass the argument without giving it a value. And this will end up being true if it's there and false if it isn't. So if I say args.isLive and I switch over here, passing is live will allow it to be true. Not passing is live will not. Excuse me. And I was almost done with the video. So you can certainly experiment with some of these arguments, but what I recommend is that you play around with this as I have just now to make sure that it all makes sense to you before you proceed on any other path in creating more programs, or rather adding more to your program. Start out by testing out your argparse, make sure that it's clear to you and that it's doing what you're expecting, and then you can move on to the rest of your assignment or whatever it is you're attempting to do. Okay, hope that was helpful, and see you in the next video.